The winds in these verses signal the arrival of the Lord in the time of trouble. See, often you and I find ourselves trapped in windy seasons of life. And when the winds of adversity and affliction blow against our lives, our tendency is to become filled with anxiety and fear. I want to show you that the winds of life should not fill us with fear, but with faith. Let me show you some blessings of the winds in our lives. I want you to understand that there's something in the wind, that God is up to something, that there's something moving in the wind. There's something moving in the spirit with God. And David, look what God tells David. They have just had a victory. They have just beat the enemy, and the enemy comes right back against them. But God is still on the throne. There's something in the wind. Listen, the first thing we see in David's context, and you can see it, and I pray that you see it in your own context, that in the wind, the presence of God is in the wind. Look to your neighbor and say, the presence of God is in the wind. See, listen, the sound of the wind was the signal that God was present with his people to lead them in victory. You see that in verse 24. And see, often the Bible uses wind to picture the presence of God. 2 Samuel 22:11, God rides the wind. He was seen upon the wings of the wind. Amen. God showed up in Eden in the wind. Genesis 3:8. And they heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. God showed up in the winds of the storm on Galilee. God showed up in the winds of the storm in Paul's life. God's presence is in the wind. See, the wind may be blowing in your life, church, but it does not mean that God has forsaken you. See, the very thing that you fear may be the thing that proves to be his presence. You got to hear me now. See, we are worried about all the things that are coming against us, but you got to realize that sometimes the very thing that you fear in your life is probably God trying to get your attention. God trying to move in your life, but because you are afraid to go off in the darkness, you forfeit an experience in the presence of God, because God is moving in the wind. And the wind may be blowing in your life. That does not mean that God has forsaken you. That could mean that God is right there with you, moving in the wind. There's something in the wind. Listen, we find the presence of God in the wind, but this text also shows us that we see the promises of God in the wind. Listen, the wind was the sign that God would give his people victory. When they heard the wind, they knew that the Lord was leading them to victory. When the Lord is moving with his people and his people are moving with him, victory will always be the result. That's why in the church today we have to be seeking what thus said the Lord. Lord, what are you saying, Lord? What are you doing, Lord? Move past my intellect. Move past my know-how. God, tell me, what are you saying? The promises of God. Listen, his presence with you is his promise of victory to you. He comes with you to lead you through the storm, to calm on every side. See, the wind may be blowing and the outcome might seem in doubt right now, but we ought to put our faith in God, who rides the wind to give us victory in his time. And guess this, and guess what? And in his way. It may look like defeat is in the wind, but God will always keep his promises to his people. See, no wind, get this now, no wind, regardless of how foul it may be, can detour the God of heaven from keeping his promises to you. What are his promises? His promises is to be in presence. His promise is peace. His promise is provision. His promise is forgiveness. His promise is grace. His promise is blessings. His promise is joy. His promise is love. His promise is forgiveness. It cannot deter you from what God has for you. Promises of God is in the wind.